I always believed intelligence could control chaos. Collect enough data points, analyze enough signals, and you could predict the unpredictable. For 18 years, I lived by that axiom, sifting through noise to find meaning while ignoring the chaos roiling inside me. My name is Victor Harlow. I'm 48 years old, though my reflection shows a man decades older. If you're hearing this, you already know something has gone horribly wrong. Maybe you've seen it on the news or heard the emergency broadcast commanding you to close all windows and wait for rescue. Maybe you've glimpsed them, those terrible shapes scuttling along rooftops, pressing against glass, leaving behind smears that look almost like desperate messages. I created them, not intentionally, but intentions mean nothing when faced with consequences. I gave birth to this horror because I couldn't accept another loss. And the worst part is, it started with the single person I loved more than anything in the world. My daughter, Eleanor. The Charcot-Merrill syndrome diagnosis came 3 years after Sarah died. One loss had already hollowed me out. I wasn't prepared for another. Sarah, my daughter's mother, had been the one person who saw past my carefully constructed walls. When Afghan insurgents detonated the IED that killed her during her humanitarian mission, something fundamental broke inside me. I remember standing at her funeral, Eleanor's small hand in mine, unable to process that the world could continue turning when Sarah no longer existed in it. My daughter became my anchor, my sole reason for waking each morning. I left military intelligence, took a private security job, arranged my schedule around her needs. I became a helicopter parent, overcompensating for the mother she'd lost. Sarah would have known how to balance protection with freedom. I only knew surveillance and control. When she turned 16, the first symptoms appeared: muscle weakness, tremors. Doctors initially dismissed it as stress, perhaps depression following the 5th anniversary of her mother's death. I knew better. The same unnatural stillness I'd felt at Sarah's grave had returned, whispering that my fragile reconstruction of a life was about to shatter again. 6 months of tests later, the diagnosis came back. Charcot-Merrill syndrome, rare, degenerative, terminal. The specialists spoke in carefully modulated tones about managing expectations, about making her comfortable. Their words blurred into white noise as I watched my child's face. She didn't cry, like she'd been expecting this invisible thief to take her too. That night, alone in my study, I shattered 3 glasses against the wall. The faint pleasure of destruction was childish, pathetic. Sarah would have known what to do. Sarah would have found strength. All I had was rage and a security clearance that gave me access to information most civilians never saw. It took 4 months of careful planning. Old contacts, carefully worded questions. Database searches masked as routine security protocols. I discovered a black-budget biotech program developing regenerative therapies for wounded special forces operators. The research was classified, the potential side effects deemed too risky for conventional approval channels. But the preliminary data suggested neurological regeneration. It could, theoretically, reverse my daughter's condition. Stealing it wasn't the hard part. The hard part was deciding to become the monster I'd spent my career fighting. Someone who placed personal desire above collective safety. But watching her grow weaker each day made the decision for me. The same detachment that made me effective at my job now allowed me to compartmentalize the risk. After all, what was one small vial compared to my daughter's life? So on that first night, I told myself, whatever it takes. I gathered the stolen biotech, hidden in a thermally insulated black case, and slipped into her bedroom. The moment I shut her door, the hush of the house seemed to magnify my heartbeat. She was lying in bed, her hair unwashed and limp against the pillow. Once vibrant auburn like her mother's, now dull copper. She gave me a fragile smile when she saw the syringe in my hand. Not curious, not afraid, just resigned. "Dad, what's that?" Her voice was a shadow of its former strength. She used to argue with me about everything, her fierce independence a constant reminder of Sarah. Now she sounded hollow, weaker every hour. "Just a new treatment," I whispered. "It might help." She nodded, like she was used to me bringing vials, pills, and therapies that never worked. "Okay, sure." Her acceptance crushed me. She was too tired to fight anymore. We'd already been through dozens of experimental treatments that offered false hope, only to fail. I pressed the needle to the vein in her arm, felt the tremor in my hand, took a breath, and injected the stolen formula into her bloodstream. My child closed her eyes. For a moment, I thought I'd done it, given her some relief. She exhaled a shaky breath, and that was it. Silence. Then the seizure hit. Her body jerked violently, her limbs flailing in spasms I'd never seen. I grabbed her shoulders, terrified I was losing her, that I'd made a fatal mistake. I tried to hold her steady, but nearly got thrown off the bed. My mind spun with fractured military training, triage protocols, emergency procedures. None of it applicable to watching my daughter die by my own hand. Just as I scrambled for my phone, she went still. No more convulsions. But her breathing had stopped. Her chest no longer rose and fell. I pressed 2 fingers to her throat. No pulse. Military training kicked in. I started CPR. 2 breaths, 30 compressions. The sibilance of my own frantic breathing filled the room. Press, count. Press, count. My daughter's life balanced on my fingertips. Then, on the 3rd compression of the 2nd cycle, she gasped. A hideous, gargled sound, but a breath all the same. I let out a sob of relief, memories of field medic training in Kandahar flashing through my mind. I'd saved wounded soldiers before, but never had my hands trembled like they did now. But something about the way she was breathing, the timing of her chest expansions, felt wrong. Almost like she was matching my breath, an exact echo of my inhale and exhale. When I tilted my head to the left, she did too, like a puppet copying every motion. The hair on my arms stood on end. It reminded me of interrogation techniques I'd observed, mirroring body language to create false intimacy. "Eleanor," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Honey?" At first, there was no response. Her eyes were open but unfocused, like the vacant stares of shell-shocked soldiers I'd debriefed after particularly brutal firefights. Then she sat upright in a single fluid motion, as if pulled by invisible wires. My eyes darted to the side table. I had sedatives. Maybe I could calm her. Before I could move, she spoke. The voice that came out of her mouth wasn't quite hers. It sounded overlaid with something deeper, a hollow resonance that set my teeth on edge. "Dad," I leaned forward, tears gathering at the corners of my eyes. "You're okay. You're alive." "Thank God," she twitched. Her expression was blank, her pupils dilated. Then I realized something that turned my stomach. Her lips weren't moving with the words. "Dad, Dad," the voice was coming from her. But her mouth stayed closed, parted only slightly to let that eerie echo pass through. Alarmed, I reached for the sedatives. But my child, or the thing controlling her, moved lightning fast. She lunged, burying her teeth in my shoulder. I felt the burn of flesh tearing, and I screamed, bashing the lamp on the nightstand against her skull. The impact sent a jolt up my arm, memories of the one time I'd struck a prisoner flooding back, the sick feeling that followed. She staggered back. Blood, my blood, ran down her chin in a thin rivulet. For a moment, I thought she'd attack again. Instead, she reached up and pressed a trembling hand to her cheek, smearing the blood into a twisted half-smile. She didn't say anything. She just stared at me, head cocked as though listening to something outside my range of hearing. And then she bent backwards, her spine contorting like a broken doll's, and scrambled across the floor in an inverted, spider-like crawl that defied human anatomy. She scuttled past the bed, found the open window I'd cracked for fresh air, and with the precise, deliberate movements of an insect, she slithered out into the night. I pulled myself up, ignoring the searing pain in my shoulder. I tried to rush after her, but by the time I shoved my head through the window, she was gone. All I saw were the quiet rooftops of the neighborhood, dark, still, absolutely no sign of my daughter. That was how the nightmare began. I don't remember passing out, but I woke the next morning on the floor of her bedroom, my shoulder throbbing. The sun was already high. My clothes were stiff with dried blood. The lamp lay shattered around me, reminding me this was all too real. The bite wound pulsed with sick heat. When I peeled back my shirt to examine it, I saw the skin around the bite had already turned a mottled purple, with thin black veins spreading outward like cracks in thin ice. A cold dread pooled in my stomach. Whatever I'd injected her with was now in me. I stumbled to her room, dreading what I'd find. The door was unlocked. Odd, since she always kept it that way. Inside, lying on the desk, was her diary. My daughter and I had grown distant after Sarah died. We each built fortresses around our grief. I threw myself into work. She withdrew into her journals, her music, her online world where I couldn't follow. Reading her diary felt like a violation, but I needed answers. I flipped the pages, scanning each frantic line. Dad, something is wrong. My hands don't feel like my hands. When I touch my face, it feels like someone else's skin. I hear my breath, but it's too slow. Like something else is breathing with me. I looked in the mirror and I swear my reflection blinked before I did. I need help. Please. 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 Help me before I do something bad. Then the last entry. I'm hungry. I pressed my palm against the page. I'd done this to her. The infection must have begun even before I injected her with the biotech. Her genetic disease, the stolen treatment, somehow they'd combined to form something beyond my comprehension. I'd played God, and God had answered with abomination. A soft scratching sound against the window made me jump. I spun around. The blinds were half drawn, letting a band of gray daylight spill across the floor. Peering through the gap, I saw nothing at first, then a flash of movement. Somebody's hand pressed against the glass, bloody with the skin peeled back along the knuckles. I froze. Eleanor? I whispered, half hoping it might be her, but the hand slid away. When I opened the window, a gust of wind rattled the blinds. But there was no one on the ledge. Only a smear of crimson across the pane. Pulse hammering, I looked down into the yard. It was empty. Tracks in the soft soil led across the lawn, heading toward the street. But the trail disappeared quickly, wiped out by the morning dew. I couldn't stay in that house. Every corner of it reminded me of her, and that final moment when she'd sunk her teeth into my shoulder. She was out there, infected with a virus or fungus or something I unleashed. I had to track her down before the police did. Or worse, before she hurt anyone else. First, I took care of my wound. It didn't look normal. The skin around the bite was a sickly purple, veins spidering outward. I cleaned it with rubbing alcohol, grit my teeth against the pain, and bandaged it best I could. The pain was almost welcome. A tangible punishment for what I'd done. After Sarah died, I'd sometimes pushed myself to physical exhaustion during training exercises, as if physical pain could somehow balance the emotional void. I made a list: find my daughter, contain her, or, in the darkest part of my mind, I wondered if I might have to kill her. The thought made me sick. I'd taken lives before, in service of my country, but this would be different. I stuffed a few things in a backpack. Water, some food, medical supplies, and the handgun I kept locked in a safe. Just in case. The diary too. There might be clues there about what was happening to her. The weapon felt heavier than it should. Sarah had hated guns. "They simplify complex problems into binary solutions," she'd said once. "Life or death with nothing in between." Now I understood what she meant. As I passed through the living room, I glanced at the family photos on the wall. One of them showed her at 10, scaling the backyard fence with a grin on her face. She'd always hated closed spaces, doors especially. After Sarah died, she'd developed a complex series of rituals around doors. She'd only pass through them sideways, never touching the handles with her bare hands. At the time, I dismissed it as childhood grief manifesting in OCD behaviors. The therapist had suggested it was her way of maintaining control when she felt powerless. I paused, staring at the photo. A memory surfaced, Eleanor at 7, trapped in a bathroom when the lock jammed. I'd broken down the door, found her huddled in the corner, hyperventilating. Sarah had held her for hours afterward, whispering reassurances while I repaired the splintered doorframe. After Sarah died, my daughter's phobia worsened. She preferred windows, rooftops, wide open fields. That trait's going to matter more than I realize. Outside, the sky was overcast. The neighborhood looked normal at first glance. But as I walked down the sidewalk, I noticed a hush. No birds, no children playing, no hum of distant traffic. It was as though the world was holding its breath, waiting. The first victim I found was near the corner store, a woman lying in a dark red slick. When I got closer, I saw she was still alive. Barely. Blood pulsed from a gash in her abdomen. Her eyes flicked up at me, wide and pleading. But her voice was just a wet rasp. I dropped to one knee, rummaging in my pack for bandages. "Hang on," I breathed, pressing gauze to the wound. "I'll get help." Before I could say anything else, something landed behind me with a soft thump. I turned, my spine rigid with recognition before I'd even processed what I was seeing. A man stood there. Or at least what was left of one. His joints were distended and bulging, his skin mapped with blackened veins that pulsed beneath the surface like living tributaries. He swayed slightly, as if his body and mind were engaged in a civil war for control. Then he crouched, his eyes scanning me with the cold calculation of a predator assessing prey. I recognized that tilt of the head. My daughter had done the same thing before she'd attacked me. My instincts screamed shoot, but I hesitated. Could this man be cured? Did he carry the same infection as her? The hesitation felt familiar. The same split-second doubt I'd experienced during my first firefight, wondering if the approaching figure was civilian or combatant. That hesitation had nearly cost me my life. He took advantage of my pause. In a blur of motion, too quick for human reflexes, he darted past me, grabbing the wounded woman by the throat. She tried to scream, but only a garbled hiss came out. Then, with a tenderness that violated everything natural, he bent down as if to listen to her heartbeat. His fingers stroked her hair, a bizarre imitation of comfort. My stomach contracted like I'd been gut-punched. Eleanor had always done that when she was upset, run her fingers through her hair or her mother's to calm herself. A gesture she'd learned from Sarah, who could diffuse her childhood tantrums with the same gentle touch. This man is mimicking her. He wasn't just infected, he was infected with her, with the habits and gestures that defined her. He turned his face toward me, smiling with blood-stained teeth. I raised the gun. My hands trembled. Before I could pull the trigger, he leapt with the precision of a jungle cat, disappearing behind a row of parked cars. A second later, I heard the scrape of claws on metal, and he was gone, scaling the side of the grocery store with the same predatory grace I'd seen in my daughter. I hurried to the woman, but I was too late. Her eyes stared blankly at the sky, her throat torn open. She was gone. That's when I heard the whisper. "Do you think they'll let me be anything I want now, Dad?" I whipped around, gun raised. Nobody. Just the wind stirring the trash in the alley. But the voice was real. It had come from somewhere. Her voice. Except it sounded distorted. Or maybe layered with an echo. the same effect I'd heard that night in her bedroom. It was the question she'd asked repeatedly after Sarah died. When we'd sit on the porch swing watching fireflies. Do you think I can be anything I want? A child trying to assert control over a future suddenly rendered uncertain. I'd always answered yes, determined to preserve her sense of possibility even as my own narrowed to a single goal, keeping her safe. I stood there, shaking, trying to process the impossible. They were all connected somehow. She was patient zero, and her consciousness was echoing through them, or maybe they were each stealing pieces of her. I took off running. I spent 2 days moving through the city, gathering intel like the analyst I once was. Sometimes I heard voices from behind closed curtains, people praying or sobbing or calling for help. Occasionally, gunshots rang out, echoing off the buildings. The city was tearing itself apart, with no official rescue in sight. By midnight on the 5th day, I'd made it to an apartment complex near the hospital. I wanted to check the records, see if there was a way to isolate what had gone wrong in her case. But the hospital was overrun by the infected. Judging from the windows shattered 5 stories up. No chance. I was cutting through the parking lot of the apartment building when I heard a familiar voice. Victor, get over here. I turned. There, crouched behind a row of abandoned cars, was Amber Larson. We'd worked together in a cybersecurity outfit after I left the military. She was ex-military herself, tough as nails, and never one to show fear. Yet now her face was streaked with panic and grime. She waved me over, pointing a handgun at the darkness behind her. Amber and I had a complicated history. I sprinted to her side, ignoring the spike of pain in my shoulder. Amber, you're alive? She let out a breath. For now. I heard you were in the city. God, Victor, what the hell is happening? I shook my head, swallowing hard. I don't have time to explain everything. Short version. There's a virus. It changes people, makes them share a collective mind, I think. They hate doors. They crawl through windows. I almost choked on the words. I made it. Her eyes widened. The same look Sarah would give me when I'd crossed the line. Then Amber did the unthinkable. She pulled me into a hug, the gun pressed awkwardly against my chest. She whispered, "Whatever you did, we have to fix it." My daughter was out there, hunting. Amber had no clue how bad it truly was. "We need to get somewhere safe," she continued, scanning the area. "I've been holed up in the basement of that building." She jerked her chin at the towering structure behind us. Concrete walls, no windows underground. We made our way to the basement, locking ourselves in a room with supplies and a radio. The infected prowled above, but never dared the doorways. While waiting out the night, a radio broadcast cut through the silence. All residents are advised to close all windows immediately. Under no circumstances should you open or climb through any unsecured aperture. The infected appeared to carry new mutations. The transmission cut to static. I slipped off my jacket to check the wound. It looked worse. Black lines radiating outward like a perverse star chart. The flesh around the bite raised and hot to the touch. The bite was weaving its corruption through my system. Cell by cell. Neuron by neuron. "You're infected," Amber said quietly. Not a question. I nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I don't know what it means. I don't feel different." "Not yet." She was silent for a long moment. "If you turn, you'll do what needs to be done," I finished for her. If I was infected, would I start crawling through windows too? Would I become a puppet to my daughter's stolen consciousness? We sat in silence, the weight of what I'd done hanging between us. Amber wanted to try for the outskirts of the city. There were rumors the National Guard had set up a perimeter, quarantining the area. But my gut said we needed to be sure. "There's a research lab, Mendenhall Labs, on the east side," I murmured. "I stole the biotech formula from there. They'll have equipment." She gave me a long stare. "You're insane if you think I'm going anywhere near that place. It's probably overrun. I need to try." My voice was hoarse. I have to fix this, Amber. Something in my tone must have struck a chord, because she hesitated and then nodded. We'll go at dawn. Less likely we'll be spotted. The infected found us before dawn could arrive. We fled through the concrete corridors of the basement. Somewhere around noon the next day, a radio broadcast came through again. Faint and broken. National Guard. Perimeter failing. Multiple casualties. Do not open doors. Do not break windows. The infected are mutating at an accelerated rate. Lock yourself in if you can. The fear in the announcer's voice sent ice down my vertebrae. One by one, we were on our own. No rescue was coming, not yet. By afternoon, the sun cut through the haze, and we found ourselves on a deserted freeway overpass. Rusted cars lined the ramp, some with broken windshields. A faint breeze tugged at Amber's hair, carrying the stench of decay. We stopped to rest in the shadow of an overturned truck, scanning for signs of pursuit. Suddenly, we heard a voice call out from behind a burned sedan. Help! Please, help me! Amber and I exchanged a wary glance. Another trap? We'd heard rumors the infected could mimic human speech to lure survivors out, but the voice sounded raw with pain. I crept toward the sedan, gun raised, while Amber covered me. A figure lay wedged between the car and the guardrail. A teenage boy, maybe 15, with a mangled leg. He clutched a metal pipe for protection, eyes wide and terrified. When he spotted me, he tried to drag himself away, whimpering. "Stay back," he croaked, lifting the pipe. "It's okay," I said softly. "We're not infected." He stared at me for a moment, then lowered the pipe, tears streaking his dusty face. "My leg's trapped. Please, can you?" Amber rushed over and helped me pry the twisted metal off his lower leg. He screamed in agony, and I bit down on my lip. The leg might be broken in multiple places. We had no real medical knowledge, but we couldn't just leave him. "What's your name?" Amber asked gently. "Eric," he gasped, wincing as we tried to straighten his leg. "I was with my parents, but..." He broke off, tears burning his cheeks. "They got sick. They turned on me. He was just a kid, possibly orphaned because of what I'd done." Amber gave me a knowing look, but she said nothing. Together, we hoisted Eric up, letting him lean on me for support. It was excruciating for him, but at least we got him free. Looking at him, I saw my child at his age, vulnerable, questioning, searching for stability in a world suddenly rendered chaotic. The impulse to protect was overwhelming. Sarah had always accused me of having a savior complex. Not everyone needs saving, Victor. Sometimes they just need to be heard. I'd never mastered that distinction. We found a piece of plywood near a construction zone and used it as a makeshift crutch so Eric could hobble along. It was slow going. Every sound made us freeze, expecting an infected swarm. But we pressed forward with Mendenhall Labs waiting 2 miles away. We reached the perimeter of Mendenhall Labs after nightfall. The facility sprawled behind tall fences topped with barbed wire. It looked deserted. Lights off, gates wide open. The smell of burnt chemicals and ozone filled the air. The laboratory complex loomed like a monument to human arrogance. To my arrogance. In stealing from this place, I'd believed I could beat nature at its own game. Now I was returning, humbled and desperate, to the scene of my crime. The campus had multiple low-slung buildings connected by walkways and courtyards. No sign of infected yet. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being watched. We made our way to the central structure labeled Research and Development. The glass doors at the entrance were smashed. A bad sign. Amber and I exchanged a glance. The infected might be inside, but if I was going to reverse the formula, that's where the equipment would be. I took a breath, forced my voice not to shake. "Let's go." Amber went first, stepping over shattered glass. Eric clung to me, his breathing ragged. The lobby was dark, except for sporadic emergency lights blinking along the corridors. Broken lab equipment littered the floor, and something reeked of chemicals. A clang echoed from a hallway to our right, followed by a grunt. Amber raised her gun, inching forward. We found ourselves in a corridor lined with glass observation windows. Most were cracked or entirely gone. The rooms behind them looked like labs, some with overturned tables and half-finished experiments. Then we saw them, 2 infected, crouched over a figure in a lab coat. The scientist, at least that's what I assumed from the coat, wasn't moving. One infected was a woman with black veins branching across her neck. The other, a younger man with blood crusted under his fingernails. They didn't tear into the body like wild animals. Instead, they seemed to be carefully touching the victim's face, turning his head side to side, almost as if studying him. The scene reminded me of my daughter at 6, examining a dead bird we'd found in the backyard. That same detached curiosity, that same head tilt. Sarah had explained death to her that day while I stood awkwardly by, uncertain how to address mortality with a child. Now that same innocent curiosity had become something perverse and predatory. My intestines coiled into a tight knot. Amber tensed, about to fire. I grabbed her arm. We had no idea how many more might be around. I motioned for us to circle around, find another corridor. She nodded, lowering her weapon reluctantly. But Eric, leaning on me, accidentally knocked a piece of debris loose. It clattered across the tile floor. The infected froze, lifting their heads in unison. I held my breath, hoping we could slip away. Then, in perfect synchrony, they turned to us. Amber fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. She hit the man in the chest, knocking him backwards. But the woman darted behind the doorframe with startling speed. Eric cried out in alarm. We bolted, half dragging Eric, weaving deeper into the labyrinth of hallways. Adrenaline surged through me like electrical current, sharpening every sense. Behind us, I heard scraping footsteps as the infected pursued. A second gunshot reverberated, Amber firing again. A shrill hiss answered from somewhere above us, like the squeal of metal under strain. We turned a corner and found a metal door with a quarantine symbol. I scanned the sign, Bio-Containment Unit. Maybe it would have secure rooms we could lock down. I shoved the door open. The hallway beyond was pitch black, save for a distant red glow from an emergency exit sign. Keep moving, Amber hissed, helping me guide Eric. A scuffling behind us. Then a whisper drifted through the darkness. Dad, are you here? Eleanor's voice. My daughter's voice echoing off these dead walls. Sweat beaded along my hairline, instantly cold against my skin. Amber stiffened. Eric let out a small sob. We found a heavy metal door labeled Clean Room. It had a handle, an actual door handle that locked. I shoved Eric inside, followed by Amber, then slammed it shut, turning the bolt. My breath came fast. We'd sealed ourselves in. Would that keep them out? The infected despised doors avoided them. But I wasn't sure that meant they couldn't break them down if they really wanted to. We stood there in the dark, hearts hammering. Then, faintly, from somewhere in the corridor, Daddy. Amber pointed her flashlight at me, eyes narrowed. That's her voice, isn't it? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The overhead lights showed a small, sterile room with stainless steel counters and sealed storage compartments. Lab instruments lay scattered around, many broken. For a moment, none of us moved. Eric slid to the floor, clutching his injured leg. I don't want to die here, he whimpered. My chest constricted like I was back in basic training with a drill sergeant standing on my sternum. I knelt beside him, took a small pack of antibiotics from my bag, and handed him 2 pills with some water. This might help with infection, I said quietly. Then I looked at Amber. You and Eric stay here. Bar the door. I'm going further in to find the equipment I need. She gripped my arm. Don't be stupid. We should stay together. But I shook my head. I have to do this. If I can get a sample of her blood from the research archives somewhere in the system, there must be a record. Maybe I can create an antidote. You said it yourself. We can't run forever. The truth was, I needed to be alone. The weight of what I'd done, the lives I destroyed through my arrogance, was crushing me. If I failed, at least Amber and Eric might survive. I owed them that much. And a part of me, the part that had been growing since that bite, wanted to be closer to my daughter, to whatever she had become. Amber seemed to read some of this in my face. She swallowed, glancing at Eric. "You'd better come back, Victor." I pressed my hand to hers, more intimately than I meant to. "Thank you," I whispered, meaning more than just her words. Before she could argue further, I unlocked the door and slipped back into the corridor, leaving them behind. The hallway was silent, except for the low hum of electricity. I held my gun in one hand, a small flashlight in the other. My shoulder pulsed with pain, and I could feel sweat trickling down my neck. "Focus, Victor." I forced myself to remember the lab's layout from the stolen documents I'd studied weeks ago. The main storage for specialized biotech materials was on the south wing, near the old incinerators. As I crept along, I passed a shattered observation window. Inside the lab was a tangle of cables and equipment with blinking lights, some experiment left running even after everything fell apart. Blood spatter coated the walls. My stomach churned. I kept going. My infected shoulder throbbed in time with my pulse. Was it my imagination, or could I sense the infected now, feel their presence like distant radio signals? The bite connecting me to them, to my daughter, in ways I couldn't articulate? At an intersection, I heard footsteps and froze, ducking behind a row of lockers. Two infected shuffled by, their heads swiveling. Both had that same twisted posture as they sniffed the air, muttering in low, distorted voices I couldn't decipher. Then they passed. I let out a silent breath and moved on. I found a set of steel double doors, barricaded with a metal bar. A sign read, "High security storage" in big letters. Exactly what I needed. I removed the bar and pressed inside. Rows of locked compartments lined the walls, each requiring a keycard. Where would I find that keycard? "Looking for this?" a voice said. I spun, gun up. My flashlight beam fell upon a figure in a lab coat. He was tall, gaunt, with sunken eyes and a nasty gash across his temple that leaked blackish blood. An infected, or a survivor. He held a key card between two fingers. "Don't come closer," I warned, finger on the trigger. He offered a sickly grin. "We're not all mindless beasts," he said calmly. "Some of us are special. The next step in evolution. And you're the father, aren't you?" His grin widened. "The one who started this all?" My diaphragm spasmed, heart suddenly beating too fast, too hard. "Who are you?" "Dr. Miles Fenwick," he replied, giving a sarcastic half-bow. "Head researcher at Mendenhall. I had the pleasure of analyzing your daughter's initial tissue samples. Fascinating transformation potential. A pity you stole our progress. We could have harnessed this in a more controlled setting." His voice sounded rational, but his eyes held the cold intensity of a dissection scalpel. I realized with a chill that he was infected, just more intact, maintaining a veneer of humanity. "Give me the keycard," I demanded. "I need to access the storage. There might be a cure." At the word cure, he snorted. "There is no cure. Don't you see? We've moved beyond that. Your daughter's condition is a gift. Humanity will adapt. Those who survive will be stronger, free from the constraints of pain, from the illusions of morality. People are dying," I growled. But even as I said it, I felt a whisper of doubt. Was this truly a disease or something more? Evolution has always demanded sacrifice. How many species had gone extinct so that humans could emerge? The thought felt alien yet familiar, as if her altered consciousness was infiltrating my own through the bite. Some sacrifices must be made. He held the key card out mockingly, waving it in the air. "But I'll humor you, dear father. Let's see if you can stop the unstoppable." My finger tightened on the trigger. "Don't do it, Victor," I told myself. We needed that key card. But I saw the mania dancing in his eyes. He'd kill me, or worse. The military analyst in me calculated risk versus reward. with cold precision. The father in me wanted to destroy anything connected to my child's suffering. I flicked the safety off. "Toss it over," he obliged with an exaggerated shrug. The key card slid across the floor. I kept my gun on him, edging closer. "Now back up," I ordered. He took one step back, still smirking. "Why fight it? Don't you want to join your daughter, become one with her mind? She's out there, you know, searching for you. Patient Zero calling to her father. Isn't that poetic?" The mention of Eleanor twisted my gut. In my distraction, he lunged. The movement was too fast to register. He knocked me sideways, slamming me into a metal cabinet. The gun skittered from my grasp. My flashlight went spinning, casting wild shadows on the ceiling. Dr. Fenwick pinned me, breath reeking of rot. "You can't stop what's coming," he hissed, black veins pulsating beneath his skin. I grappled with him, my erratic heartbeat drowning out all other sounds. His teeth were inches from my face. With a surge of desperation, I kneed him in the stomach. He doubled over. My hand found a stray metal rod on the floor. I swung it at his head. The impact made a sickening crack. He stumbled away, vile black fluid dripping from his mouth. I scrambled for my gun, found it half hidden under a desk. As Fenwick recovered, I fired twice. The shots rang in the sterile corridor, echoing. He collapsed, eyes wide with a mix of shock and something like triumph. I panted, chest heaving. I snatched the keycard from the floor and turned to the locked compartments. My hands shook as I swiped the card. Each beep felt too loud. Finally, one door slid open, revealing a chamber of biohazard containers, tubes of chemicals, and vials labeled with alphanumeric codes. I rummaged through them, scanning for anything referencing her condition. E. Harlow, EHS, Charcot Merrill, anything. My vision blurred from stress and the throbbing bite wound. The bandage was soaked again. After what felt like hours, I found a locked fridge labeled experimental strain number VM207, the stolen formula. Maybe inside I'd find the data needed to create an antidote. I swiped the card again. The fridge door hissed open. Rows of vials glowed under a pale light, each connected to a small computerized device. The screen flickered, reading data backup accessible. My chest surged with hope. If I could download this data, maybe I could resynthesize something to reverse the infection. I fumbled for a USB drive from the cluttered desk behind me, hooking it into the device's port. The screen displayed a progress bar. Then I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway again, more than one pair. The commotion with Fenwick must have drawn attention, infected. My time was running out. Come on. The progress bar crawled. The footsteps were right outside the storage room now. At last, the screen beeped. Transfer complete. I grabbed the USB, shoved it in my pocket, and spun toward the door. Two infected silhouettes loomed beyond the frosted glass. They hate doors, I reminded myself. But that wouldn't stop them from smashing the glass if they wanted in. Keeping my eyes on the door, I sidled over to Dr. Fenwick's body. I felt a pang of revulsion, but I searched him quickly, found a small ring of keys. Maybe they'd open another route. The silhouettes outside didn't move. They seemed to hover there, heads cocked as though confused by the closed door. I stepped away from the door, scanning the room for an alternative exit. There was a vent at the back, but it was too small. Another door led to a side corridor. It was locked, but I had Fenwick's keys. I hurried over, hand trembling, as I tested them one by one. Finally, the third key worked. The door hissed open, revealing a dark passage. A low moan drifted from behind me. I realized with horror that Fenwick was still alive. If only barely. He reached for my ankle. "You can't fix it," he rasped, blood gurgling. "It's not broken. It's evolving." I stared down at him, heart thudding. "I have to try," I whispered. He gave a sick, rattling laugh. "Then we'll see you on the other side." His eyes rolled back. His hand went limp. I pushed through the open door, locking it behind me. Dr. Fenwick's last words clung to me like a curse. After navigating through corridors filled with infected, I returned to Amber and Eric. We escaped the lab, but were captured by private mercenaries led by a man named Archer. They dragged us to a secure compound, separating us from Eric, who they left behind. Archer was clear about his intentions. We do want to contain it, but a cure. That might cut into certain interests. My client might prefer a different approach, weaponizing the data instead of neutralizing it, tapping its potential. My stomach dropped. I realized with a burst of horror that Amber must have known about these mercenaries. That's why she was so cold, so driven. She'd been planning to contact them, or they'd contacted her. You sold us out? She couldn't meet my eyes. They have resources we need, she said quietly. They can protect us while we develop the cure. I scoffed, bitterness clawing up my throat. They'll exploit it, not cure it. Archer nodded. He catches on quick. The mercenaries locked us in separate rooms. I spent hours plotting escape, examining every inch of my prison. Eventually, Archer brought me to a makeshift lab where he expected me to help weaponize the virus. You'll do it, or you'll watch Ms. Larson die first, he threatened. Then we'll throw you out to the infected. Your choice. A cold sweat broke across my forehead. Archer held all the cards. But maybe I can bide my time. I nodded stiffly. Fine, take me to the lab. As I worked, Amber was brought in, bruised but alive. We exchanged a glance that said more than words. She'd made a deal with devils, gotten double-crossed, and now we were both pawns. By sunset, Archer had made his intentions clear. We would join his team on a mission to capture Eleanor or kill her and harvest tissue to complete his bioweapon. But before the mission could begin, an unexpected ally appeared outside our locked room. Eric had somehow survived and tracked us down. More shocking, he wasn't alone. She helped me escape the infected downtown, Eric explained through the bars of our window. I think she's like them, but not exactly. She said her name was Eleanor. My skin turned to ice. She said she was looking for you, Eric added in a trembling whisper. Said she could sense you were in trouble. My heart lurched. My daughter, my Eleanor, was still in there somewhere. Not entirely consumed by the infection, but fighting it. The same stubborn determination she'd shown throughout her illness, refusing to let the disease define her. Sarah's daughter through and through. Despite her apparent help to Eric, when Archer's convoy took us downtown to find her, Eleanor remained a mystery. When she emerged from the shadows, I saw the black veins under her skin, the tilt of her head. But in her eyes, something flickered. Recognition. The same look she'd given me after Sarah's funeral, when we both realized we were alone together in our grief. Eleanor, I whispered, stepping closer. I'm sorry. I never meant for this. In a blink, Archer's men opened fire. Chaos erupted as the infected swarmed from all directions. I used the confusion to approach her, begging for a blood sample that might lead to a cure. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she extended an arm, veins pulsing. I fumbled for a syringe from my vest pocket, one I'd taken from Archer's lab. My hands trembled as I inserted the needle and drew blood. Archer appeared out of nowhere, grabbing my shoulder. Excellent, he hissed, ripping the vial from my grasp. Eleanor snarled, lunging at him. Archer bashed her with his rifle butt. She collapsed to the ground, letting out a whimper. I roared in fury, tackling Archer. We crashed onto the pavement. Then a gunshot. Archer jerked, eyes wide. Blood blossomed across his chest. Behind him, Amber stood with a smoking pistol. She'd shot him in the back. The glass vial slipped from his hand and shattered. No, I cried. The sample splattered across the concrete. Our only chance at a cure. Amber's eyes widened in horror. Victor, I'm sorry. I didn't have time to respond. My child staggered up, ignoring the bullet wound in her side. She lurched toward me, eyes fixated. I stood, ignoring the throbbing pain, arms outstretched. Eleanor, I pleaded. She paused, as if memorizing my face. Then came the final blow. A spear of metal rebar shot through her chest from behind. One of Archer's men, half shredded by infected bites, had mustered the last of his strength. He pulled the rebar free, and her body dropped. "No!" I screamed, dropping to my knees. She lay there, eyes already dimming. I cradled her head, tears streaming down my cheeks. Her lips moved, forming silent words. I leaned in. She mouthed, "Close. All windows." Then her body went still. In that moment, I felt something snap within me. Not just grief, but a connection I hadn't fully recognized. The bite on my shoulder suddenly burned cold, as if the infection itself was acknowledging her passing. Patient 0 was gone, but the legacy she'd created lived on in the infected, and in me. Chaos raged around us, infected swarming the last few mercenaries. Amber fired a few more shots, then rushed to my side. "Victor, we have to go." Eric emerged from behind a column, hobbling over. His eyes fell on Eleanor's body, and a tremor shook him. I'm sorry," he whispered. I pressed a shaking hand to my daughter's still face. Her blood stained my clothes, dark and cold. Everything we'd tried, all for nothing. The rebar had destroyed her heart. No miracle cure. No second chances. I felt hollow, emptied of purpose. First Sarah, now Eleanor, the two anchors of my life gone. What remained was a shell, a man infected by his own daughter, carrying within him the very plague he'd helped create. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. I, who had always sought control, now embodied chaos. We trudged away from the city, Eric limping, Amber silent, me haunted by my daughter's final words. Close all windows. She'd been telling me that for weeks. The bite on my shoulder no longer hurt. It had gone numb, the black tendrils now reaching my collarbone. I didn't know how much time I had before I joined the ranks of the infected. Would I retain consciousness like Eleanor seemed to? Or would I become a mindless vector of this new evolution? Strange thoughts infiltrated my mind as we walked. Maybe this was nature's way of forcing connection on a species that had grown too isolated, too individualistic. Maybe my daughter's fear of doors, of closed spaces, of separation, had become the template for a new kind of collective consciousness, one that demanded openness, even as it destroyed individual autonomy. If you're reading this, heed the warnings. If the broadcasts say to close all windows, do it. If you hear your loved ones calling from outside, do not open the door. The infected are mutating, and they remember every weakness we've ever had. As for me, I can feel her in my veins now, my daughter, my punishment, and perhaps, in some twisted way, my redemption. The black lines have reached my neck. Soon, I'll join her collective mind. And strangely, I'm no longer afraid. That's the end of this story. If you liked it, please consider subscribing. It would really help me out. I appreciate you, and I'll see you soon.